My name is Michelle Rempel Garner, and I'm the Member of Parliament for Calgary-Nose Hill. And for the better part of the pandemic, I served as the Vice Chair for the Federal House of Commons Standing Committee on Health. And for the last 2.5 years, well, 2 years roughly, I've watched my community go through a very, very difficult time with the pandemic restrictions. And I have always fought for a path forward that ensures Canadian freedoms, public safety, and more. So today, I want to very clearly outline where we have been, where we are today, and where we need to go. And I have a few things that I appeal to the federal Liberal government for today, and to you as the listening public, on behalf of my community in Calgary-Nose Hill. So we need to go back to understand where we are today. We need to go back to February 2020. So you'll remember that in February 2020, we all watched as COVID was spreading around the world. We watched as morgues were overflowing in Italy and in New York City. And there was a lot of scramble to understand what COVID was and how best to prevent it. So that's when restrictions began. And restrictions were put in place over the last 2 years to do 5 things. They were originally to figure out what COVID was, to contain COVID, to give us time to get vaccines and therapeutics, to incent people to get vaccinated, and ensure that we have enough capacity in hospitals to deal with acute urgent care patients. So here we are today, and there are still restrictions in place. So any restrictions should be measured against those objectives on if they are still necessary, right? So let's break down whether or not logically those restrictions are still necessary. And my argument is no, they aren't. But I want to walk you through why they aren't. So on point number 1, restrictions to find out what COVID is. Well, we know what COVID is today. There's still research that needs to be done on long COVID, but restrictions aren't necessary to do that. And anybody who's arguing that COVID zero is possible, I mean, COVID is everywhere. Look at New Zealand. Look at some of the most isolated places in the world. COVID is everywhere. And for us to ignore that and not be planning towards an endemic state where COVID is with us all the time, actually, I would argue harms Canadians, because if we don't have a plan on how to live with COVID, then how are we going to live with it? So trying to pretend that COVID restrictions are somehow going to get us to a COVID zero state is just not realistic. It's not possible. So point number 2, that was point number 2. Point number 3, I want to start a little bit about the Omicron variant. The Omicron variant has also shown that COVID changes, it mutates. So yes, we need to have a plan to ensure that we are living with COVID. But the Omicron variant has also shown that COVID is constantly changing and evolving. There are vaccinated Canadians who are getting Omicron. So restrictions to stop the spread of COVID are ignoring the reality of how COVID spreads, right? We have vaccines, we have therapeutics. I am fully vaccinated, I am boosted. I am glad for that. I encourage you to do the same. At the same time, we also have to recognize that it's not going away. It's here. So that goes into point number 3. The restrictions buying us time to get vaccines and therapeutics. We now have vaccines and therapeutics. Over 80% of Canadians are vaccinated. Thank you to those who have done so. And millions more have received a 3rd dose. We also have approved viable therapeutics to treat those who are immunocompromised, who have severe COVID, and reduce the burden on our healthcare system. So to say that we need restrictions to get more of those tools, we have those tools. Do we need to probably address how COVID is changing the future? Yes, but we can't keep asking Canadians to sacrifice their freedom, their mental health, their jobs, their livelihoods, our way of life to do this. If we can't figure that out going forward, then the system is broken. We can't keep asking Canadians to sacrifice their freedoms because we don't have a system that allows us to address getting these types of tools when pathogens emerge. And that's what government needs to be focused on, is a plan to do that. On the fourth point, a very controversial point that many of you will have very charged opinions on, restrictions that incent people to get vaccinated. And if you remember back in the fall, I'm here in Alberta today, the provincial government put in place the vaccine passport program in order to encourage and incentivize people to get vaccinated. While we're several months away from that now, the federal government put in place similar restrictions on air travel, trucker vaccinations, etc., to incent people to get vaccinated. I would argue that 6 months into it, anybody that's got vaccinated is vaccinated, and I would like, if somebody in the government would like to show me data that continuing these restrictions are going to somehow incent more people to get vaccinated, I'd love to see that, but I just know that data hasn't existed. I encourage people to get vaccinated, but if they haven't gotten vaccinated to this date, they have made a choice. They have made a choice. Now that leads to an even more controversial opinion, or we've seen in some parts of the country, some governments suggesting that people who aren't vaccinated should be taxed because of a burden on the healthcare system. I disagree with this point, because universal care is universal care until it's not, right? And if our system is so fundamentally broken that an infectious disease causes our ICUs to functionally collapse, then the system is broken. And we need to put everything on the table to figure out how the federal government can have a convening role to fix that system. Additional restrictions on us are not going to fix a broken healthcare system. To doctors or nurses who might be listening right now, my heart goes out to you. You have been on the front lines. You are our national heroes. We thank you. Every Canadian thanks you for the work that you have done. And now all of us, regardless of where we're at on this debate, need to be pushing governments to fix a broken healthcare system in order to stand up for these people who have been treating us over the last 2.5 years. And before that, we're dealing with a system with systemic failures. It should frighten every Canadian to think that an extra 300 people in the ICU overwhelms our healthcare system in Canada. The federal government should be using its convening role to find out ways to support provincial governments in addressing things like critical healthcare labor shortages, wages, sustainability, broken or bloated bureaucratic systems. These are things that are usually taboo to talk about in Canadian politics, because the politics of healthcare is typically one level of government points a finger at another and hopes that it goes away. Well, COVID has shown that is a pretty big problem when it comes to dealing with the management of Canadian public health care. So every single one of us needs to be advocating for the federal government to use its convening role to do things like low-hanging fruit things. Like, we've got healthcare professionals in Canada who have credentials from foreign countries, and yet they have huge barriers to entry to get into this. This needs to be addressed. The brokenness of our healthcare system needs to be addressed. But more restrictions, more lockdown after 2 years, at this point, it's not buying governments more time to do this. They just haven't done it. And other approaches are needed, because we shouldn't be asking Canadians to keep sacrificing their freedom, their mental health, their jobs to fix a problem that has been decades in the making. What I wanted to say to you is that I think lockdowns at this point are pathetic band-aids used by politicians to cover up a lack of political will to address a fundamentally broken healthcare system. So we need to not normalize lockdowns. We need to move beyond that, and we need to work together across party lines and across levels of government with healthcare professionals, with people who are in the space who have been raising these alarm bells for years in order to address it. So that bridges into where we go from here. So I have several asks for my colleagues of all political stripes and all levels of government today. First of all, I call upon the federal government to give us all a firm plan on when all the restrictions in their scope of jurisdiction will be lifted. These include vaccination passports for air travelers, PCR testing requirements for international travel, and on-arrival testing. The government cannot present data that shows that these measures are doing anything new to slow the spread of COVID or address the problems that I've raised today. It's incumbent on them to do so, and it's incumbent on them to have a plan to permanently lift restrictions. I ask that the federal government reinstate the pandemic early warning system that they shuttered prior to the start of COVID. I asked them to do this and tie that to a set of easy to understand rules for travelers who are in hot zones to make sure that these measures are never needed again. This is something that our party campaigned on in the last election. This is vitally important. I don't understand why our country does not have a pandemic warning system and that we're relying on WHO data to make decisions for the health and well-being of our country. Restrictions are not going to fix this. Only political will, and the federal government has known this is a problem for a long period of time. This needs to happen right away. As I said earlier, I call on the federal government to use its convening capacity to ensure that there's a conversation on how we fix our lack of ICU surge capacity across the country. We need to address things, like I said already, why we aren't more readily accrediting foreign healthcare professionals that are in Canada, how we're addressing healthcare wages, and how we're addressing the bloated bureaucracies that we see in many healthcare systems across the country. These have formerly been taboo topics. They can't be anymore, and the federal government has a role to play in convening and supporting provinces in addressing these challenges. I also ask governments at all levels to recognize that it's wrong to use the removals of freedoms as a personal fix to gloss over the brokenness of our healthcare system. The restrictions that we've put on Canadians over the last several years are extreme and should never be normalized, particularly for the extended period of time that we have seen here in Canada. Fourth, I ask that all governments recognize that the way that they've communicated information to the public over the course of the pandemic has been a disaster of epic proportions. Between our Chief Public Health Officer of Canada flip-flopping on mask usage at the start of the pandemic, or our National Vaccine Task Force suggesting that the AstraZeneca wasn't safe, sent the message to every Canadian that it wasn't safe to trust the system, and it allowed conspiracy theories to be normalized. At a time when every government was asking Canadians for trust, this is what was happening, and nobody was trying to fix it outside of opposition saying that this is something that should transcend party lines and should be dealt with. I moved motions in the House of Commons to this effect. We have to normalize saying that we don't know what's going on, but here's what we're doing to fix it. And that's what everybody should have been saying at every point of time during the pandemic in order to bring the public along so that there was trust in institutions. We need to restore this trust, and it starts by admitting that the government failed. I ask all sides today to de-escalate the rhetoric on the pandemic. Justin Trudeau helped no one when he suggested that unvaccinated Canadians, he painted them with the broad strokes of saying that they were misogynists and racists. I would also say that permanently blockading public infrastructure is against the rule of law. The temperature needs to come down lest we lose something greater as a country. Everybody, including you who are watching it today, has a responsibility here. Because if we actually believe in democracy, if we actually believe in the rule of law, then we need to address all the points that I've had today in a way that respects everybody. And that means de-escalating the rhetoric, taking the temperature down, and demanding solutions. Concrete solutions that address the problems that we see today. I ask the government to understand that the cost of maintaining restrictions is greater than any other cost at this point, based on the data that's been presented to me, particularly in my former role as Vice Chair of the Federal Health Committee. Our economy is in a shambles in this country. The cost of living is out of control. We have a national mental health crisis. We have civil unrest. And we have many Canadians who have lost faith in public institutions. Restrictions are not doing anything to fix any of those problems. And as government and as members, we have to be turning our eyes to those issues in order to truly represent those who have given us a mandate to speak for them. I now want to speak specifically to Justin Trudeau. I want to make an appeal to reason across party lines. I know that you think, Justin Trudeau, restrictions are the best wedge issue since abortion between Liberals and Conservatives, and that your language on this and your treatment in the last several weeks on this issue might catapult you into another term in office. Your continued escalation of rhetoric without any acknowledgement of the points that I have raised, I feel is proof positive of this motive. I'd like to think that it's not true. But today, you need to come out and realize that what is happening is bigger than your or my or anyone else's political careers. We need to do something right away to ensure that Canada can come out of the pandemic united, strong and focused on economic recovery, focused on dealing with the mental health crisis in this country, and focused on dealing with the brokenness of our federal healthcare system. And as Prime Minister of this country, it's your job to do this. So I ask you to put politics aside. I ask you to be a leader, because you are the Prime Minister today, and this is your job. You have a moral imperative to do this. You have a moral imperative to put political gain aside and fix these problems. To everybody else who's listening today, you all have a role to play in this too. Over the last year, we've been sitting at home in lockdowns. Many of you have lost your jobs, and many of you, we're getting our news on social media, and we're not talking to each other face to face, eyeball to eyeball, and trying to understand each other rather than trying to silo and increase rhetoric. And that breaks my heart. It breaks my heart. Every Canadian today needs to be focused on solutions, and ensuring that we're uniting as a country. So we're not out of the woods yet, but as a Canadian, when we look back through our country's history, when we are faced with times of crisis, we continually overcome as a people. And everybody who's watching this today, it's up to you. Doesn't matter what political stripe you are, vaccinated, unvaccinated, liberal, conservative, whatever, we have got to come through this. We need to have peace, and we need to ensure that our freedoms are restored, and we need to ensure that our economic benefit, our prosperity, our hope for the future is restored. So, an appeal to reason, an appeal to peace, an appeal to justice. Working hard for you in Calgary. Have a great day.